Day of the Eunuch, a short story. Day of the Eunuch, or Cheng's Giraffes. The narrator relates encounters with an old Chinese man of uncertain years. Things haven't been the same around here since the day of the eunuch, Mr. Cheng complained again. I was walking across the ginger-spiced streetscapes of Little India, crossing the bridge into Old Town, but going the river way, along the lonely stretch. I turned the corner onto the neat paving, gave a nod to the shrine of the ancestors, vermilion and gold, and there, at first hidden by the big white hibiscus in a pot, was Mr. Cheng, quietly sketching the river view in coloured pencil. His completed work was spread out on an old tablecloth. He sketched heritage buildings and exotic animals, particularly giraffes. He did particularly good giraffes. He sold his sketches for a meagre ringgit. It was his usual greeting. Things haven't been the same around here since the day of the eunuch. To which you would say, "Seems not, Mr. Cheng. How are things otherwise?" And he would say, "Oh, fine, fine. Nice drop of rain overnight." He was amiable and astute, Mr. Cheng, but never stopped sketching as he spoke. I first met him at the Green Vintage Cafe. He was sketching there too. Consequently, he rarely looked up, but was a study in coloured pencil concentration. The first words he said to me that day were, "Things haven't been the same around here since the day of the eunuch." When he left, Miss Yan, the barista, said that he was creepy. He made her want to light joss to the kitchen gods. I said he had the sort of translucent skin on his hands that you get in elderly Asian men, and she shuddered. Then he was in the odd little alcove signifying nothing off Jonker Street. "Mr. Cheng, you say?" He glances up from his sketch pad, and you notice that his eyes are translucent and yellowing too, and sure enough he says, "Things haven't been the same around here since the day of the eunuch." Then, one day, you meet him among the horseshoe graves on China Hill during the approach of a purple storm front, and another time in a straggling laneway curling around the back of Kampong Cooley Street. Eventually, curiosity bleats its rancid predictability. For a start, you wonder why a man selling hand sketches of touristic viewpoints and African animals is not camped among the tourists. They don't straggle in the laneway curling around the back of Kampong Cooley Street. And secondly, you wonder what he means when he says, "Things haven't been the same around here since the day of the eunuch." What means the day of the eunuch? I had to ask. So I asked my friend Harold, also a Chinaman, on that fateful occasion he first introduced me to Cham. The last thing I need, I was telling him, is a new addiction. The Cham was delicious, as creamy as the moon, as sweet as diabetes. By the way, I say, what means the day of the eunuch? No idea, he said. Why do you ask? Oh, it's just something that Mr. Cheng says. Who? Mr. Cheng. You must know him, old guy. Sells colour pencil sketches to the tourists. You know, giraffes. Not able to place him, said Harold. He had, like Mr. Cheng, lived in Malacca all his splendid days. I described the old sketch artist, certain he was a local notoriety. Harold said no, and amnesia I attributed, possibly, to too much Cham. Uncle Rufus, the Indian encyclopedia, did not know him either, and could shed no light upon the day of the eunuch, so-called. Well, things haven't been the same around here ever since, I assured him, and he agreed on that at least. I was therefore unrequited. I had to ask Mr. Cheng himself. "I've been meaning to ask you, Mr. Cheng," I began, "what means the day of the eunuch?" But the old man avoided the inquiry. The rain, he said, started at about 4 a.m, and it continued warm and musical until 6. He could remember more complicated times when the rain regularly interrupted breakfast. The encounter then was unfulfilling. The lonely stretch along the riverway was usually uneventful. There was certainly nothing worth sketching. Mr. Cheng confounded my day. As it happens, though, a chance skirmish in an antique emporium in the poor end of Hareen Street that same afternoon reckoned my wanting. It was an old book, dog-eared. A lady from Singapore saw it just after me. I said she could have it. She said, "No, not at all, La." I purchased it upon her kind concession. It recounted, in bad English, the long-legged life of Admiral Cheng Ho, and cast there the subtitle, Eunuch of the Seven Seas. This same Cheng Ho, or someone of the same label I recalled, had a big rock dedicated to him just near the new UNESCO boardwalk. The word eunuch, of course, struck me like a swift kick between the legs. It was in fact a booklet, not a full-scale tome, about 60 pages, and I devoured it with a long dim sum in the famous cafe on the corner. When I next encountered Mr. Cheng, therefore, I would come prepared with at least a clue. It happened on the following Wednesday. The Green Vintage is shut on Wednesdays, and so I often jaunt along Lorong Hang Jebat, hoping for scrambled eggs. On this occasion, a "Hoi!" arrived from the open cafe near Said's under the deep blue awning, and it was the voice of Mr. Cheng calling out, "Narrator! Narrator!" He called me narrator. I told him that in my country that would be considered cheeky, so he did it all the more. "Mr. Cheng," I say, pleasantly surprised. He was calling over to me to join him. My eyes did a quick beady over the chalkboard menu to see if they were doing any cham. He was fresh as a daisy, I could see, Mr. Cheng. The years had not diminished his morning spring. "Well, how are things?" I wondered, sitting down. He shook his head. "Things haven't been the same around here since the day of the eunuch," he lamented. "Aha! Cheng Ho," I said, giving him the stare. He stopped his sketching and paused, then looked up. Quickly he shuffled through a backlog of sketches in his carry bag and produced a sketch of a Chinese ancient, bearded and stern, in all his admiralty. "Cheng Ho," he announced. "The eunuch," I replied. He was pleased. "And the day of the eunuch?" I wondered. He spoke of the sketch. He was quite a big man, you know, stocky, dignified. He had what you Australians call a wide perspective. I told him I had never heard an Australian ever use that expression ever, but I took his point all the same. The Cheng Ho in question, readers need to understand, was as refined as early Ming, and being a eunuch kept his nose out of the emperor's business. One day he set out in search of treasures to ornament the Middle Kingdom. He sailed a very, very big ship. He sailed all the way to Zanzibar. Then, a steamy afternoon in November, on his way home, he sailed to the mouth of the Malacca River and went ashore with a sumptuous landing party and conveyed greetings from the celestial throne in the jade spectacle of the Forbidden City. His warships had whammy, but he said he came just to say hello and collect a tiny tribute. Old Town was already old, they say. The Chinese traded tin along the river. Cheng Ho was no threat to the local girls, so the clan houses donated 3,000 coconuts, and suddenly, this is according to the book from the antique store at the poor end of Hareen Street, the nation of Malaya was born. All the usual ontological leaps of Sino-heroics. "You knew him personally," I joked to old Mr. Cheng. "Briefly," he said, and put the sketch away. I was mighty interested in the cham, to be honest, and did not quite measure my host's chronology. Yet I mused to him, as I by this stage presumed, that the so-called day of was perhaps the day he came ashore, Cheng Ho, that is. I had been to the big rock. It was sandstone. It was emblazoned with a brass plaque claiming that hereupon, or just nearby, first stepped the eunuch, and this was the year 14-something or other. It was the day China rowed ashore and said hello with geopolitical consequences. Just up from the rock is the Cheng Museum and the Cheng T-shirt bazaar. I'd been there too. "Let's go for a walk," suggested Mr. Tang. This was going to be more difficult than you'd think. He had his bicycle and all his sketch equipment and folders of finished work. We made our way, after Cham, however, to the second bridge, or the first one if you're going the other way, which edifice Mr. Tang informed me was once a drawbridge. In the days the river was somewhat deeper. He spoke fondly of the giant cogs. Then we turned past the tourist information Pusat, where the trishaws play Hotel California all day, and strolled by the rusted menace of the cannons Portuguese on the fortress walls. They still pointed seaward, optimistically in view of 20th century land reclamations. "Then came the Portuguese," sighed old Mr. Tang philosophically. As we crossed the thoroughfare, I was pushing the bike, I said playfully, "What were they like, the Portuguese?" "There weren't many of them, actually," he said. "The officers on the ships served the king, but the sailors were Indians and Arabs and Ethiopics and Persians and Burmese." He thought about this for a moment and then added, "And there were no women." "In those days," he said, "Bukit St. Paul poked out of the sea like a knob on a biscuit. You could walk along at low tide and sweep up a basket full of crabs." When we reached a large vacant area tangled in verdure, I stopped and pondered, "How old are you, Mr. Tang, if you don't mind me asking?" "How old do you think I am?" he asked in return. "Not a day over 75, I said. He giggled in his wispy goatee. Then he stopped and cast his hand out across the vacant land. It was rather wretched. It made me think of dengue fever. But once, he said, it was better drained before they put the bypass in, and a veritable meadow where the river lingers in the embrace of the salty sea. Other than a palm tree or two, it was once an open plain." "Now imagine, if you will," he said, now delving into his folders and producing therefrom a sketch or two of his giraffes. "Giraffes, grazing gently." "Grazing gently? You mean here, on this land?" "Correct," he said. Then he told me a story. When he was a boy, his father, a tin merchant, owned a store on Jalan Pantai, and they lived cramped in the room upstairs. "It was just like you Australians and your Huckleberry Finn," he said. I raised an eyebrow. He explained that in those days, Jalan Pantai had access to the riverbanks, a muddy mess of mangroves then, and in his illustriousness and spare time he had made a raft and planned to traverse the mighty waterway in a spirit of young adventure. "Every boy runs away from home once in their life," he mused. I reckoned, though, that the estimated journey was barely a mile and a half. Nevertheless, there was a raft and a river and a boy, and Mr. Tang described the vessel and the conditions and the type of songs that he sang as he pushed out from the riverbank, and the drift of the river caught his ballast. Not to be outdone, and with no attempt to put Huckleberry Finn back in his proper setting, I related raft-making episodes of boyhood on the mighty Murrumbidgee. "Now imagine, if you will," said Mr. Tang again. This was his idiom, "now imagine, if you will." He turned me around and demonstrated the proximity of the river, in fact. "Here I am, sailing down the river on my raft," he says, "with my what do you Australians call it? My knapsack." "Swag," I said. "Knapsack. Sailing down the river on my raft with my knapsack. Running away from home. My father was a tin merchant," he said. "I see." "And then," he says, "and then?" "What?" "I look over the riverbank. The river was high. I look up, out across these meadows here, and you know what I see?" "Giraffes?" "Giraffes," he says, now enormously happy. It was as if there had been a sudden breakthrough. He grinned as wide as the summer solstice. "That's when I started drawing," he said. "I moored the raft and just had to draw them because I knew I could never describe them to someone. How do you describe a giraffe? With lots of neck and legs, I guess, I said. He had been drawing ever since. Out of necessity, he eventually moved on from giraffes and added lions, tigers and heritage architecture. He made a modest living. So there were giraffes here, is that what you're saying? I wanted it clarified. Cheng, he explained, had been to Zanzibar. The person he described as the Prime Minister of Zanzibar, I was sure this was not quite correct, had donated giraffes to the Celestial Emperor in a fit of long-necked goodwill. Anybody with a ship as big as Cheng Ho's deserved a giraffe, was what he was thinking. For his part, Cheng Ho mistook the creatures for the legendary Hong Lok, a long-lost, long-necked beastie from the mythical pastures before the great flood of the Yangtze. He can be forgiven for not knowing modern taxonomy. He'd heard the legends when he still had his testicles. The cham had worn off by this time, and I could glimpse the chronological debacle before me at last. But Cheng Ho was in the 14-something or other, I objected. The old Chinaman looked at me as if to say, "You Australians and your bizarre Julian calendar." He was unimpressed with years and had disdain for those who would count them. It was only natural to count giraffes, though. "There were 4 of them," he said. 2 pairs. "You must have thought you'd sailed all the way to Africa," I offered. As I say, I reckoned it to be about 1.5 miles. It probably seemed much further to a young son of a tin merchant. But when was this? Unimportant. He wanted me to hold up his giraffe masterpieces and imagine them, if you will, sauntering, indeed grazing, in yonder wasteland. We were only a stone's throw from the new, sprawling supermarket complex. "Are these feral giraffes?" I asked. "Is there any other kind?" he asked. I rephrased the question. "Are you saying, Mr. Tang, that when you were a boy there were giraffes roaming these paddocks? Feral giraffes, descended from the giraffes of Cheng Ho?" "Where," he replied, "do you think Cheng Ho grazed his giraffes when he landed in Malacca? Perhaps. But when was this?" The old man was confusing, as old men can be, but it was a cute rendition of his artistic beginnings. He turned to colour pencil, he said, to render the creature's splendid spots. Then he directed my attention further still to the wretched stretch of grazing land, erstwhile paddocks on the riverside, and asked me what was missing. As an Australian, I said, I'd say lashings of barbed wire. You can't graze animals without barbed wire. "Water," he said. "Water?" "Well, there's no water for the giraffes," he pointed out, it being plainly obvious. "So there's not," I said. "This was when he met Cheng Ho briefly," he then explained, and my chronological quandaries went into narratorship, and I smiled and said, "All right, Mr. Tang." His story was this. Being all huckleberry, there was no way he was going to keep out of adventure. He took up his knapsack, swag, I said, rolled up his sketches and went over to the clan houses where the Admiral and his sumptuous landing party were being feted just that day as long-removed Chinese brethren. The tin business was lucrative long before rubber. The Straits Chinese had mastered smelting when Malay tribes were still engaged in warfare over goats. "I was just a boy, you understand," he said, so no one stopped me. He worked his way through the throng, slipped into the main clan hall, dodged a guard, and arrived just as there was a break in what had been notably solemn proceedings. All the gods were there, and the ancestors. The Admiral himself seemed semi-divine. They had women too, he added, unlike the Portuguese. Beautiful women, goddesses of pearl from the imperial court. Then suddenly, by a stroke of great fortune, there I was, standing immediately before him. "Who?" I insisted. "Cheng Ho." Standing immediately before him. And so I said, imagine if you will, I said to him, "Here, sir, a tribute." And I handed him my sketch of the giraffe. And then I said, "Please, sir, your giraffes do not have any water. I will water them for you in return for passage to the Forbidden City." "Who?" Cheng Ho. Anyway, said Mr. Tang. He laughed, he did. A huge laugh. Have you ever heard a eunuch belly laugh before? No, I admitted. I haven't. Never mind, he said. He laughed, and he said he would take my drawing back to the Emperor as a gift, and I could water his giraffes, but no one can go to the Forbidden City. I guess that's why it's called the Forbidden City, I mused. And then my father, who was there, saw me and snaffled me, as you Australians say, and took me home and gave me a beating. I wanted to shine a positive light on this conclusion. Well, at least, I said, you discovered something you love, sketching. On that account alone, it was a worthwhile misadventure or delusion, call it what you will. So, did you get to water the giraffes? I wondered. No, he said. I wasn't allowed out for a month. By then, Cheng Ho's fleet had sailed away and the giraffes were gone. I gazed over the vacant and, to my sensibility, feverish lands once more with narratorish suspension of disbelief. When was this? I asked again. In my mind's eye I could see them, 4 of them, comprehensively out of place, wondering where all the high-hanging nibbles had gone. Outlandish creatures of antediluvian misproportions. Australia has its share of mythic fauna. When I was a boy, said Mr. Tang, smiling. That was when. This was all exceedingly interesting, but after pondering it uncomfortably for a few minutes, I decided it would go better with Cham. There had to be a Cham outlet nearby, and there was, in the grim cement nowhere of Malacca Raya. Oh, the vapours of urban felicity. The establishment belonged to the only Turk in Malacca, Kemal, and he had mastered the art of Cham in Istanbul before the purges, he said. Mr. Tang, in habit, took out his sketch pad and put his head down and continued the conversation in his usual manner. There was a picture on the wall. It was a stylisation of an old map with drawings of porpoises and sailing ships in a wide flotilla along with points of the compass. Cheng Ho, I puzzled. Mr. Tang glanced up at the picture. No, he said. That's the British. I didn't mind the British. I had a lot of trouble with the Dutch. Did you? I did. But you know, narrator, looking back, I've come to realise that that day on my raft, floating down the river, that's when everything started to change. The day of the eunuch? Cheng Ho, he said, had rich varicosities on his rotund cheeks from lavish living and too little testosterone, but otherwise was a disciplined man. When he stepped upon the rock, the vast tide of Chinese history became reconnected, and the flood of change, far greater than any that had afflicted the Yangtze, sluiced through the lives of subsequent generations. The clan houses amended their family trees. New technologies would soon arrive. The point of demarcation was a boyhood sending dreams down a muddy river. Things haven't been the same around here since the day of the eunuch, he said, as a general disposition. Only a man with a long view, I understood, could see it that way. Tell me, I said, do you tell the tourists this story? He looked at me with old cunning. You're not a tourist? He smiled. Please, I said. No, he said. That's right. You're the narrator. Do you sell many sketches of giraffes? I asked. Everybody loves giraffes, he said. The Chinese love giraffes. Don't tell me, I said. They regard them as good luck, along with 1,000 other unlikely things. Correct, he said. The Chinese regard them as good luck. Mr. Tang, I said, I asked you not to tell me that. He laughed heartily, but not, apparently, like a eunuch. He eventually changed the topic back to the weather. He and Kemal conducted a 15-minute seminar on how dry the dry season had been. That, however, was the extent of our walk. A visionary recital at dengue feverland, Huckleberry Ching revisited, some old sketches and another glass of cham at Kemal's. He packed his accoutrements onto his bicycle and yelled out, "See you later, narrator," as you Australians would say, as he rode off in search of paying art lovers at the mall. I could not share Miss Yan's dire estimation, but when I was next at Green Vintage, I mentioned him and prefaced it with the old gentleman who does the pictures of giraffes. He what? She said. Giraffes, you know. She couldn't place him. You thought he was creepy, I said. She explained that in that case she had probably burnt Joss to the kitchen gods, and the kitchen gods had removed the unpleasant recollection from her memory entirely. I don't remember him, she said. Neither, on further prompting, did Harold. How could he live the whole of his life in Malacca Fair and not know Mr. Tang? He hangs about with St. Francis up on the hill, I explained, adding further landmarks. But Harold said, nope, and added, he sounds like a loony. Uncle Rufus had other notions. He suggested I go to the temple, smash 3 coconuts, make puja to Ganesh, and then go home and have a shower. I think he is not the man he says he is, he said ominously. What was that supposed to mean? In any case, Uncle Rufus still didn't know him. He's been around, I remarked, but for how long? A few days after this, I went up to Bukit St. Paul, where Francis Xavier hangs out, seeking the sketch artist in question. He wasn't there. Most likely he had his tablecloth spread out in some shady lorong where tourists never venture. From the view on the Bukit, I could see the reclamation works continuing still and the dredges, and it took considerable aplomb to envision it all in the days of the great treasure hunts of history. I can imagine Cheng Ho's big ship and his charming war fleet being majestic off the coast. I can even imagine them unloading the Prime Minister of Zanzibar's giraffes onto ponts, taking them to Meadow, a shore where they could stretch their knobbly sea legs. The rest was satisfactory as a mystery. The next time I ran into Mr. Cheng, what was he doing near the KFC at Kampong Chetty? And he said, things haven't been the same around here since the day of the Eunuch. I could fathom his gist somewhat and say, keep on sketching, Mr. Tang, and cherish the people with wide perspectives you meet in a forgotten city like Malacca. He put his head down and kept on with his coloured pencils. Then, with an Australian checkiness, I asked him if, when he grew tired of giraffes and Afrikaner and Sino-Portuguese up and downs along the crafted river with their distinctive windows, if he would like to make a sketch of me. I would pay him in tourist ringgits, naturally. He didn't look up. Oh, I already have, he said. Really? In 1923, he said, matter-of-factly. He still didn't look up. He kept drawing. 1923? 1923 was the year they built the ornate Western and Oriental, which I saw in its pasty blue Art Deco ruination, the year AD emboldened on the chunky lintel every morning from my apartment on Bendahara Road. I laughed. This was a man who took no account of the cycles of the sun. That's what you get abiding just a stone's throw from the equator, I suppose. He changed colours. It was another giraffe. More good luck. Then he changed the topic to the weather and the way the monsoon would shortly reconcile the earth with the sky and the north with the south again.